Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So today's video will be about function of language, speech as action. And next slide. And we are from group 7. And the member of the group 7 is Ahliwan Davrialdi, Yuni Rahayu, and me as the moderator, Tiara Duyaninda. Next. We will be discussing about Austin's speech acts theory and categorizing speech acts, indirect speech acts, and sentence types. And our first material will be presented by Ahliwan Davrialdi. Ahliwan Davrialdi, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, moderator. Before I present the material, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So for the introduction, our main focus on this chapter will focus on the language use, and we look at the idea that part of the meaning utterance is its intended in social function. So previously on the first semester or the second semester, if I'm not mistaken, the main function of the language is to communication. So rather than learning a language for the other functions such as to show up identity and so on and so forth, communication is the main function that we need to concern. Next slide. Okay, so in this chapter we will talk about speech act. So what is speech act? Speech act is a subfield of pragmatics that studies how words are used not only to present information but also to carry out action. For example, when we speak hello or good morning, it is not to present an information, but it is an action. It is to apologize to 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 what we call it, to complain or to invitation, to compliment, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So the terminology of the Speech Act is introduced by G.L. Austin in 1975. There are two characteristics of Speech Act. The first is interactivity, and the second is context dependence. For the interactivity, what is interactivity? Interactivity is communicating function involve the speaker in a coordinate activity with other language speaker. So in interactivity, we need more than one speaker that do interactive. The next characteristic is context dependence. Context dependence has two aspects. Wait a minute. Okay, the first aspect is rely on social convention to support. So in speech act, not all of people can do. For example, there is a judge who speaks, I sentence you to hang by the neck until death. Memutuskan untuk kamu digantung hingga mati. Itu kan yang pantas atau yang berkewenangan untuk mengucapkan hal tersebut adalah hakim itu sendiri. Tidak. Aspek is the local context speech act. Am I audible? No? Wait a minute. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Previously we have learned about the characteristic of speech act. Now, we know that in a sentence there are several types. The first is declarative. Declarative is a sentences that um, usually is an assertion. For example, Siobhan will paint Anaglifta. And the interrogative, as you can see on your screen, it is a question sentences usually. For example, will Siobhan paint the Anaglifta? And imperative, it is an order sentences. Siobhan paint the Anaglifta. And the last type is optative. It is about wishes. Example, if only Siobhan would paint the Anaglifta. But in speech of action, speech as action, I mean, not all of these types is their usually function, such as not all of the interrogative sentences is a pure question sentence. Um, yeah, that's the speech of action. Next slide, please. Okay, now we move to the Austin speech act theory. Next slide. Okay, so Austin did two observation in his research. The first is the his first observation said not all sentences are statements, and some conversation is made up by question, exclamation, comment. For example, excuse me, like what I said previously on the introduction. Hello, and how much are you serious? So that's the sentences that is not a question. Yeah, I mean, there is not a statement. There is not a true or false statement. And the second observation is even in sentences with the grammatical form of declarative, not all are used to make statements. For example, I named this ship the Flying Dutchman. I bet you £5 that he get breathalyzed. So this example is not a true or false statement. It is an action which form as a speech. Next slide. Okay, evaluating formative utterance. Next. So Austin argued that um, not useful to ask whether performative utterance previously example is true or not. We should or we are better to ask do they work or not. So the speech act example I gave before, it is not a statement about true or not, but it is about work or not, understandable or not. So that's it. Next slide, please. Okay, it is Austin terminology. In the Austin terminology, a performative that works is called felicitus, and one that does not, it is inflexitus. And felicity condition means the enabling condition for a performative. For example, felicity condition is where we are able to, we are might to perform our speech act itself. For example, if we hang out with our circle, we know each other characteristic in speaking, and so on and so forth. Fallacy two is when the speech is understandable, and the inflexitus was when the speech act is it doesn't understandable from for our audience. Next slide, please. So when we do a speech act, there are two types of performative. The first is explicit, which is clear and brief, and the second is implicit performative, which is implicit that we know implicit, right? Next slide, please. Okay, here's the example. The explicit performative is tend to begin with a first person verb in a form we could describe as simple present. For example, I bet, I warn, or I name, or what next? For example, from example book, you can read the PDF. And the second point is this verb belongs to a special class describing verbal activities. For example, promise, warn, sentence, name, and so on and so forth. And generally, their performance nature can be emphasized by inserting by the verb hereby, as described earlier. It is about the just additional adverb. And the implicit performative, it is when an utterance does not has explicit characteristic, but it's still understood as explicit. For example, here's the example: "Come up and see me sometime." It is a implicit form, and the explicit form is "I invite you to come up and see me sometime." So it has the same meaning, but it is more what we call it. It is more hidden in implicit performative. Okay, maybe that's all for me. Thank you. Back to moderator.
Okay, the next material will be presented by Uni. Uni, time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. So the next material is about statements as performative. Speech acts subject to felicity condition are to be contrasted with declarative sentences which are potentially true or false description of situation. The latter were termed constative. Jadi setelah performatif yang telah dijelaskan oleh Iwan tadi, ada juga namanya performative dalam bentuk statement, dan term ini juga disebut sebagai constative. And beside that, the linguistic survey by Sadek and Zwicky find that the all utterance have a speech that they are sangat mirip, yaitu declarative, interrogative, and imperative. So simply, all utterance have a speech act that there are two basic parts to meaning. For the first one, is the conventional meaning of the sentence, often described as a proposition and the speaker's intent speech act. Okay, for example, actually this sentence, you might see on the previous slide that it is the sentence of type, but here we have the propositional meaning uniting to form a speech act as the speaker intend to the speech act. For the example, Sioban paint the anaglipta. Sioban is the person of the name, and anaglipta is the something like wallpaper pattern. So here and then plus Sioban is painting the anaglipta. It's like the declarative statement, so it make the clear the sentence is. And then the second example is Sioban paint the anaglipta. Plus, is Sioban painting the anaglipta? It can be an interrogative or question. And the third one is Sioban paint the anaglipta. Sioban paint the anaglipta. It can be the imperative sentence. And the last is we could say the optative or wish, we can add the sentence that if only Soban would paint the anaglipta. Okay, the next is about three facets of speech act. Austin proposed that communicating a speech act consists of three elements. The first is the speaker says something. The second is the speaker signal and associated speech act. And the third is the speech act causes an effect on her listener or the participants. So there are three elements of speech act. The first one we call locutionary act. The locutionary act is the saying something that makes sense in a language. The second is illocutionary act. It is the statement as intended by the speaker. And the third one is perlocutionary act, the consequent effect of on the hearer that the speaker intent should follow from their utterance. For the example, should her, that it is like the imperative sentence you might see on the action movie, and then we can see that the should her is the locutionary act. It makes sense language because it is the imperative language. And the second one is illocutionary act in that it's something like because the should her is imperative, so it make the listener want to do that or not. And the third element is perlocutionary act in this sentence. In this sentence of the example should her, it might the effect of the listener, like they have to do that or not. Okay. The next part is about categorizing speech act. So Shirley proposed that all acts fall into the 5 main types. The first one is representative, which commit to the speaker the truth of the expressed proposition. We can find it on the other thing or concluding. And the second one is directive, which are attempts by the speaker to get the address to do something. We can find it on requesting or questioning. And then commissive. Commissive is commit the speaker to some future course of the action. We can find it on promising, threatening, offering. And then expressive. Expressive is the express a psychological state, such as thanking, apologizing, welcoming, and congratulating. And then the last is declaration. Declaration is something like formative, which the effect immediate change in the institutional state of affair and which tend to rely on elaborate extra-linguistic institution. We can find it on the case like excommunicating, declaring war, christening, marrying, firing from employment. And then in distinguishing these acts, you might see on the page 20 and 29 for more details. Shirley distinguish between condition for an act into the first one is preparatory, the second is propositional, and then sincerity, and the last is essential. Okay, maybe that's all for me. Back to the moderator.
Okay, thank you so much, Uni. For the next material will be presented by me. Next slide, please. So, understanding indirect speech. Next slide, please. So, show views of how we understand indirect speech acts is that we combine our knowledge of three elements to support a change of inference. And the elements are the felicity condition of direct speech acts and the context of the U-turns and principles of conversational cooperation, such as the Grecian maxims of relevance and quality and etc. So we can briefly sketch how these three types of knowledge are used in this chain of reasoning by looking at the example in the next slide, please. So the example is, can you pass the salt? In an everyday situation, the context will tell the hearer that the speaker should already know that he can pass the salt, and thus he recognizes that the question violates the felicity condition for a question. And the assumption of cooperative principles, however, leads the hearer to search for some other point for the utterance. This is essentially the search for an indirect speech act, and the hearer asks himself as it were, if it can be a genuine question, what is the purpose of this utterance? The hearer knows that a condition for request is that the hearer can actually carry out a desired act, and also recognize that they say yes here is to confirm that a preparatory condition for doing a has been met. The hearer also knows as part of general background knowledge that passing salt around the table is a usual part of meals. So this is a reasonable goal for the speaker to entertain. From these pieces of knowledge, the hearer infers that the speaker U-turns is likely to be request on one problem with this account that it does not consider the idiomatic quality of many indirect acts. As Searles and another have noted, it is not all clear that a parallel question, are you able to pass me the salt, would be interpreted in the same way, even though can and be able to are largely synonymous. And this difference is confirmed by the different possibilities of occurrence with please and usually an optional marker of request. And thus, can you please pass me the salt sounds fine, while are you able to please pass me the salt sounds decidedly odd. And Searle's response to this seems to be that while the account of inference we have just outlined stands, there is a certain degree of conventionality about forms like can you being used as request. Other writers tried the balance differently, and Gordon, for example, see here as employing shortcuts known as conversational postulates. And these are rules that are engaged whenever the hearer is encouraged by conversational principles to search for an direct speech act as described above. And the postulates reduce the amount of inference involved in tracing the indirect act. And the relevant postulate for our presenting example will be in the slide above. Okay, next slide, please. Indirect acts and politeness. Next slide. So most commentators on indirect speech acts have remarked on the role of politeness. And Searle, for example, writes in the field of indirect elocutionary acts, the area of directives is the most useful to study because ordinary conversational requirement of politeness normally make it awkward to issue flat imperative statement, are explicit performatives, and we therefore seek to find indirect means to our illocutionary ends. And in directives, politeness is this chief of motivation of indirectness. And the role of politeness in social interaction and conversational has been an important topic in sociology and conversational studies. We cannot hope to review this large literature here, but a few remarks might shed useful light on the issue of indirect speech acts. And we can begin by noting that the work of the sociologist Erving Goffman on the social construction of the self and his notion of the face, roughly the public image and individual seeks the project, has influenced a number of linguistic studies which have dealt with politeness, including Brown and Levinson, and also many else. And in Brown and Levinson version, the face is the public self-image that every member of society wants to claim for himself. For them, the face has two components: a positive face, and which represents an individual desire to seem worthy and deserving of approval, and a negative face, which represents an individual desire to be autonomous and impeded by others. And a kind of mutual self-interest requires that conversational participants maintain in both their own face and their interactor's face. In this view, many verbal interactions are potential threats to face. And next slide, please. And the last will be the sentence types. Our final section to take us to an issue we raised in this chapter to decide whether a given grammatically category, say subjunctive, is a marker of a sentence type, or some semantic category like mood. We have defined a sentence type as a conventional matching between a grammatical form and a speech act. And thus, some language have a question word which contrasts with a declarative word, as in the Somali examples at 836A and B below, where there is also a contrast with a lack of such a word, or zero marking for the imperative, as in the example below, which is the 836A. And as we can see, as this sentence show, the question word in 8.36A, is ma, while wa in 36B marks a declarative. These words are called classifiers in Saed, and Grandlick marks a similar distinction with a different verbal inflection for person and etc. Okay, I think that's all for our materials today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next section. It is the question and answer section in tonight's Zoom. Thank you. Udah kan? Tunggu, aku ini dulu.